Jeffrey Dahmer looked, by most accounts, like an ordinary guy. He was soft-spoken, polite, and unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person who wouldn't stand out in a crowd. Yet behind that unassuming facade hid one of the most horrifying serial killers in modern history. Over the course of 13 years, Dahmer committed unspeakable crimes against 17 young men and boys. Tonight I'll tell you the story of how this seemingly normal man became a monster, luring victims into a nightmare, and how he was ultimately brought to justice. Dahmer's story begins in a typical Midwestern childhood. He was born in 1960 and grew up in a middle-class family. From a young age, though, those close to him noticed disturbing signs that something wasn't right. As a boy, Jeffrey had an unusual fascination with death and anatomy. He collected dead animals from the roadside and dissected them in the woods near his house, preserving their bones as trophies. He was oddly thrilled by the sound and feel of bones, a fixation that hinted at the darkness to come. Apart from these morbid hobbies, his early life was marked by a growing sense of isolation. He felt increasingly alienated, began drinking alcohol heavily in his teens, and struggled to connect with others. By the time he graduated high school in 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer was a deeply troubled 18-year-old with mounting inner demons. Only weeks after his graduation, Dahmer's dark urges escalated to murder for the first time. In June 1978, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old who was on his way to a concert. Dahmer invited the young man back to his parents' house. He had the place to himself, with the promise of beer and some conversation. The two spent a few hours drinking and talking, but when Hicks eventually wanted to leave, something snapped in Dahmer. Terrified of being left alone and driven by a twisted desire to possess this person, Dahmer struck Stephen Hicks from behind with a dumbbell and then strangled him. It was a sudden, brutal act. Dahmer later admitted he hadn't really planned to kill that day, but he simply couldn't stand the idea of Hicks walking out. In the aftermath, Dahmer was faced with the grim task of disposing of the body. Showing a stomach-churning calm, he dismembered Hicks's corpse in the basement, dissolving flesh in acid and smashing the bones to bits with a sledgehammer. He scattered the remains in the woods behind his house, erasing nearly all traces of the crime. This was Jeffrey Dahmer's first kill. He was only a teenager, and he had gotten away with murder. After that initial horror, years went by without another known victim. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Dahmer tried to live a normal life on the surface. He briefly attended college, flunking out quickly due to his drinking problem, and then enlisted in the U.S. Army. For a time, it seemed like maybe he had left his dark impulses behind. But his alcoholism and antisocial behavior persisted. He was discharged from the Army in the early 1980s and drifted for a bit, living in Florida for a short while before returning to the Midwest. By 1986, Dahmer was back in Wisconsin, living with his grandmother in Milwaukee. He held down a job and appeared to be just another quiet, if eccentric, young man. But inside, his urges were building again. He had begun going out to gay bars and bookstores, nursing fantasies about taking complete control over a partner. Loneliness and twisted desire were gnawing at him, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he would do something terrible again. In late 1987, Dahmer's impulses exploded back into violence. He met a man named Stephen Twomey at a bar and got a hotel room for the night, presumably for company and sex. According to Dahmer, he didn't originally plan to kill Twomey. He said he just wanted to drug him and lie next to him. But after drinking heavily that night, Dahmer awoke in the morning to find Twomey dead beside him, his chest battered and blood coming from his mouth. Dahmer later claimed he had no memory of committing the murder, suggesting he might have attacked Twomey in a drunken blackout. Whether he remembered it or not, he faced the same problem he had with his first victim, a body that needed to disappear. He bought a large suitcase to transport Twomey's corpse back to his grandmother's house, then once again dismembered the remains and disposed of them. Unlike with Stephen Hicks years earlier, this time Dahmer kept a gruesome souvenir. He preserved Twomey's skull for a while as a memento before eventually destroying it. This second murder was a turning point for Jeffrey Dahmer. As horrifying as it sounds, killing had awakened something in him. He later admitted that after Twomey, he felt he'd crossed a point of no return. he began actively hunting for victims to feed the compulsion that now dominated him. From 1987 onward, Jeffrey Dahmer embarked on a ghastly killing spree, claiming one victim after another, in quick succession. His hunting grounds were the nightlife and streets of Milwaukee. Dahmer frequented gay bars, clubs, and the surrounding areas, looking for young men who were alone or in need of some cash. Many of his targets were people on the fringes of society, drifters, runaways, or simply guys who weren't likely to be immediately missed. A significant number of his victims were Black or Asian young men, part of the diverse gay community in the city. Dahmer's approach was chillingly calculated. He would strike up a conversation, offer his prospective victim money to come back to his place, maybe to pose for photographs, watch a movie, or just hang out and drink beer. With his polite demeanor and an easy smile, he didn't seem threatening at all. In fact, several people later recalled that Dahmer came off as friendly, even a bit shy. He had a way of gaining his victims' trust, just long enough to get them behind closed doors. Once he had someone in the privacy of his home, the trap was sprung. Inside either his grandmother's house in the early years, or later his own small apartment on North 25th Street, Dahmer's methods followed a sickening pattern. He would hand his guest a drink he had secretly laced with potent sedative drugs. Often, it was sleeping pills or some kind of tranquilizer mixed into beer or liquor. The unsuspecting man would quickly become dizzy and pass out, rendered almost comatose by the drug. With his victim now utterly defenseless, Dahmer was in his element. He reveled in having complete control. He often lingered a while, lying next to the unconscious person, listening to their heartbeat, savoring the feeling of not being alone. But the end was always the same. When he was ready, Dahmer would strangle his victim to death, usually with his bare hands. It was important to him that they not leave, ever. What happened after the murders is almost too gruesome to believe. Jeffrey Dahmer indulged in acts that defy any sense of morality or sanity. After killing these men, he didn't simply dispose of their bodies. Instead, he treated the bodies as objects for his twisted desires. He performed sexual acts on the corpses. In other words, Dahmer was a necrophiliac, deriving pleasure from the dead. He dismembered many of the bodies, methodically cutting up the remains. In some cases, he kept body parts as macabre trophies, skulls, skeletons, and other organs that he preserved in jars or the freezer. His apartment became a grotesque collection of human remains. Perhaps the most shocking of all, Dahmer admitted that he cannibalized some of his victims. He cooked and ate pieces of their flesh. He later rationalized this by saying he wanted his victims to become a part of him forever. These stomach-turning details earned him the infamous nickname the Milwaukee Cannibal, once the public learned of his crimes. At the time, though, no one around Dahmer had a clue about the horrors happening in that house and apartment. He went about his daily life, working at a local chocolate factory, greeting neighbors in the hallway, all while storing human heads in his fridge and bones in his closet. The contrast is almost impossible to fathom. The polite neighbor who offered people sandwiches, yes, he actually did that on occasion, versus the predator who, behind closed doors, was committing acts worthy of a horror movie. Dahmer's depravity knew few bounds. He even tried to push the limits of his cruel experiments on human victims. As his crimes escalated, he became obsessed with a bizarre idea. He wanted to create a living, submissive zombie who would stay with him under his control. To achieve this, Dahmer performed crude brain surgery on some of his victims while they were still alive but unconscious. He drilled holes into their skulls and injected substances like acid or boiling water into the brain, hoping to essentially lobotomize them into a permanent submissive state. It's almost beyond comprehension, but he attempted this on at least a couple of men. Needless to say, these grotesque experiments did not produce mindless living sex slaves as Dahmer envisioned. They only caused further agony and eventually death for his victims. The level of cruelty and detachment required for someone to do this is staggering, and it underscores just how mentally disturbed Jeffrey Dahmer had become. One of the most tragic episodes illustrating Dahmer's cunning and the failure of authorities to stop him sooner occurred in May 1991. On that day, a young Laotian American teenager named Konorak Synthesomphony became Dahmer's target. He was only 14 years old. Dahmer lured the boy to his apartment with an offer of money to pose for photos. Like the others, Konarak was drugged and then subjected to Dahmer's torturous experiment, a hole drilled in his skull with acid injected into it. Miraculously, despite his grave injuries, the boy later woke up, dazed and incoherent, and managed to wander out of the apartment while Dahmer was momentarily out. Imagine the scene. It's the early hours of the morning, and this poor 14-year-old boy is found on the street, naked, confused, and bleeding. Frantic neighbors called 911, desperate to get him help. Milwaukee police officers arrived to find two young women trying to comfort the boy, clearly sensing something is very wrong. And then, astonishingly, who strolls up but Jeffrey Dahmer himself, calm as can be. Dahmer coolly tells the officers that the boy is actually his 19-year-old boyfriend, who's just had too much to drink after a quarrel. The boy, barely conscious, can't contradict this outrageous lie. The two women are alarmed and point out the boy's injuries, pleading with the officers that this is a child in danger. But the police choose to believe Dahmer. In an almost unbelievable turn of events, they actually escort Dahmer and the dazed boy back to Dahmer's apartment. The officers took Dahmer at his word that this was just a lover's spat and left the scene, even as the apartment reeked of a foul odor, the smell of a decomposing body from a previous victim, which the cops somehow ignored. Once the police left, Dahmer promptly killed Konarak, adding the teenager to his list of victims. This horrifying incident was a massive missed opportunity to save a life and catch a killer. It later came to light and caused a huge public outcry. How could the authorities have returned a vulnerable child to the hands of a murderer? But in that moment in 1991, Dahmer's smooth-talking deception and the police's indifference allowed him to carry on his murderous activities a little while longer. By the summer of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was completely out of control. He was killing at a frenzied pace, sometimes one victim per week, and his apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, was literally overflowing with evidence of his crimes. He had human remains in various states of preservation all over the place. It was only a matter of time before something gave way. And indeed, in July 1991, fate, and a would-be victim with remarkable courage, finally intervened to stop Jeffrey Dahmer for good. On the evening of the 22nd of July, 1991, Dahmer approached three men on the street with a familiar proposition. "Come back to my place. I'll give you $100 to hang out, drink beer, and pose for some nude photographs." By this point, this was a line he had used on many young men, and tragically, it had worked on so many of them. That night, one of the trio, a 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards, decided to take Dahmer up on the offer. He probably thought it sounded like easy money and a little party, nothing too out of the ordinary. So Edwards accompanied Dahmer back to his apartment. As soon as Edwards stepped inside apartment 213, he knew something was off. There was a powerful, rotten stench that hit him immediately, the smell of death, though he didn't yet know its source. He noticed several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor, which Dahmer casually shrugged off as cleaning supplies. Trying to brush aside his unease, Edwards engaged in some small talk with Dahmer. But within minutes, the situation turned dangerous. Dahmer convinced Edwards to take a look at his tropical fish tank in the bedroom, and as Edwards was distracted by the fish, Dahmer suddenly snapped a handcuff on Edwards' wrist. He then pulled a knife and told Edwards he intended to take nude pictures of him. In that instant, Tracy Edwards realized he was in deadly peril. Now, Edwards was unarmed, partially handcuffed, and trapped in a small apartment with a serial killer. He later described how he had to stay calm and think on his feet to survive. He decided to play along just enough to find an escape. He coaxed Dahmer into letting him sit back down in the living room where it was cooler, under the pretense of needing a break. In a terrifying game of psychological chess, Edwards tried to keep Dahmer at ease, even telling him that he was his friend and wasn't going to run away. All the while, Edwards' mind was racing for a plan. At one point, Dahmer had the knife pressed against Edwards' chest and was listening to his heartbeat, chillingly telling him he planned to eat his heart. Despite the horror of that moment, Edwards remained remarkably composed. He waited for Dahmer to lose focus for just a second, and when Dahmer did, perhaps glancing towards the television or otherwise distracted, Edwards seized the moment. He punched Dahmer with all his might, knocking the man back, and bolted for the door. With the handcuffs still dangling from one wrist, Tracy Edwards ran out of that apartment, literally running for his life. Around 11:30 p.m., two Milwaukee police officers cruising nearby were flagged down by a frantic Tracy Edwards. He was disheveled, terrified, and had that handcuff hanging from his wrist. He told the officers that a freak had put the cuffs on him and threatened him with a knife. Edwards begged them to come back with him to the apartment to get the key and investigate this dangerous man. Sensing something serious was afoot, the officers, Rolf Mueller and Robert Roth, followed Edwards to the building and up to Dahmer's apartment door. When Dahmer answered the knock, he was relatively calm, but he couldn't hide everything. The officers immediately noticed the same foul odor that had alarmed Edwards. Dahmer admitted he had put the handcuffs on Edwards, offering a lame excuse about a misunderstanding. Edwards, summoning his courage, told the cops that Dahmer had threatened him with a knife in the bedroom. At this point, Officer Mueller decided to check the bedroom, while Officer Roth stayed with Dahmer in the living room, likely watching him closely. As Mueller entered the bedroom, what he saw defied imagination. The first thing was a large knife under the bed. That was concerning enough. But then Mueller's gaze fell upon an open drawer, and inside it, a stack of Polaroid photographs. These photos showed human bodies in various stages of dismemberment, and shockingly, they appeared to have been taken right there, in that very apartment. Mueller realized in an instant that these were real, not some horror movie stills. He carried the Polaroids out to show his partner, muttering, "These are for real." Upon seeing the evidence of murder literally in their hands, the officers moved to arrest Dahmer. In that moment, Dahmer panicked and fought back, but the two cops overpowered him after a brief struggle and managed to handcuff him behind his back. With Dahmer finally subdued on the floor, Officer Mueller opened the refrigerator and nearly jumped back in shock. Sitting on the bottom shelf was a freshly severed human head, staring back at him. It's hard to imagine the horror of that discovery, and it was just the beginning. The officers called for backup, and once more police arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the apartment. What they found was a house of horrors beyond anything the city of Milwaukee had ever seen. In the kitchen, they discovered a total of 4 severed human heads. The refrigerator and freezer contained human hearts, organs, and flesh wrapped in plastic bags. There was an entire human torso in the freezer. In the bedroom and a closet, investigators found 7 skulls, some bleached white, some painted like morbid souvenirs. There was a large blue drum in one corner, filled with a stew of acid and 3 dismembered torsos dissolving inside. They also found 2 entire skeletons, a box full of bones and other body parts, including hands and genitals stored around the apartment. And of course, there were the Polaroid pictures, a total of 74 photographs documenting the gruesome process of how Dahmer had mutilated his victims' bodies. One police official later said that collecting all these remains was like dismantling a museum of horrors. Seasoned officers and evidence technicians were shaken to their core by the things they saw in apartment 213. The secret life of Jeffrey Dahmer was finally laid bare, and it was worse than anyone could have imagined. With his bloody souvenirs literally laid out on the kitchen counter as evidence, Jeffrey Dahmer had no wiggle room to deny what he'd done. He was immediately arrested that night and taken to the police station. Over the next days and weeks, investigators and FBI agents descended on the case, trying to identify the remains and piece together the full extent of Dahmer's crimes. For his part, Dahmer surprisingly didn't fight it much. In fact, once in custody, he waived his right to have a lawyer present and began confessing in detail to everything he had done. It was as if a dam burst. He talked for hours and hours, over several interrogation sessions, calmly describing one murder after another. In total, he confessed to killing 17 people between 1978 and 1991. He laid out his methods without much prompting, how he drugged, strangled, dismembered, and disposed of his victims. He admitted to the cannibalism and the necrophilia. He also spoke about why he did it, or at least tried to explain. He said he had these obsessive fantasies and urges that he couldn't control, a desire to have complete control over someone, to keep them with him no matter what. He even acknowledged at times that what he'd done was irreparably wrong. At one point, he told detectives, "I should be dead for what I've done." The investigators, many of whom had seen bad stuff in their careers, were stunned by the sheer brutality and scope of Dahmer's actions. The case quickly became national news, and people all over America, indeed all over the world, were horrified and fascinated in equal measure as the details came out. How could someone so monstrous have lived among us, unassuming and undetected, for so long? In January 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began in Milwaukee. Given that he had outright confessed and the physical evidence was overwhelming, there was never any doubt about who committed the crimes. The main question was the state of Dahmer's mind. Was he legally sane and thus fully responsible for his actions? Or was he suffering from a mental illness that made him unable to control himself? Dahmer had pleaded guilty to the murders but claimed he was insane, so the trial's focus was on his sanity. Over 2 weeks, the court heard from psychiatric experts from both sides. The defense painted Dahmer as deeply disturbed, pointing to his necrophilia, the obsessive nature of his crimes, and his odd behaviors, essentially arguing that only someone insane could do these things. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that Dahmer might be sick, but he wasn't legally insane. He knew what he was doing was wrong, and he planned his crimes meticulously to avoid getting caught. They noted how he lured victims, and the lengths he took to hide evidence as proof that he was in control of his actions. In the end, the jury agreed with the prosecution. They found that Jeffrey Dahmer was legally sane when he committed the murders. He was convicted on all 15 counts of first-degree murder in Wisconsin. There were 17 victims total, but one murder had occurred in Ohio, and another charge was dropped for technical reasons. When the verdict was announced, Dahmer was impassive. He had expected this outcome. A few days later, at his sentencing, he actually addressed the court and the victims' families. In a brief statement, he expressed remorse for what he had done, saying he was so sorry and that he wished he could undo it all, but of course he knew he couldn't. He said he never wanted freedom again, and even welcomed the idea of his own death, if that could bring any peace to the families. He admitted he deserved whatever punishment came. It was a grim and emotionally charged courtroom scene. The judge then pronounced the sentence. Dahmer received multiple life terms in prison, adding up to no possibility of release, essentially 941 years behind bars. In Wisconsin, the death penalty is not an option. It had been abolished in the state since the 19th century, so life in prison was the maximum. Dahmer was led away to begin his incarceration, and for the first time in over a decade, the people of Milwaukee could sleep without fear of this particular killer. Once in prison, Dahmer was initially kept in solitary confinement for his own safety. Such was the notoriety of his crimes that other inmates might try to harm him. After a while, he was moved into the general population at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. By most accounts, he was a quiet, obedient prisoner. He reportedly found religion, meeting with a pastor, and even getting baptized in jail, seeking some form of redemption. He also supposedly expressed remorse on multiple occasions and cooperated with interviews, trying to understand his psyche. Some people wondered if he truly felt sorry or if it was just another act, but we'll never really know his innermost thoughts. What we do know is that Jeffrey Dahmer did not live out a long life in prison. Justice, or perhaps vengeance, caught up with him in a brutal fashion. On the morning of the 28th of November, 1994, a little over 2 years into his sentence, Dahmer was assigned to a work detail cleaning the prison gym bathrooms, along with 2 other inmates. One of those inmates was a man named Christopher Scarver, who was in prison for murder. The 3 men were left unattended for a brief period. At some point during their cleaning duty, Scarver retrieved a metal bar, like a broom handle or a piece of gym equipment, and attacked Jeffrey Dahmer. In a rage, Scarver bludgeoned Dahmer severely around the head and face. He also attacked the other inmate, who later died from his injuries as well. Guards found Dahmer on the floor of the bathroom, alive but barely. His head had been bashed in badly. They rushed him to the hospital, but there was nothing the doctors could do. Dahmer was pronounced dead an hour later. He was 34 years old. When questioned about the motive, Christopher Scarver claimed that he was disgusted by Dahmer's crimes. There were reports that Dahmer had been the target of hostility from other prisoners because of what he did to children and the nature of his murders. Scarver apparently said that in the moment, God told me to do it, and that he viewed killing Dahmer as a form of divine retribution. Regardless of his reasons, Scarver was quickly convicted of Dahmer's murder and given additional life sentences. Jeffrey Dahmer's violent life had come to an equally violent end, not at the hands of the state or the courts, but at the hands of a fellow convict. News of Dahmer's death brought mixed reactions from the public and, most importantly, from the families of his victims. Some expressed relief that he was gone, as if a weight had been lifted. They wouldn't have to think about him living out his days, or worry about him ever somehow being free. One victim's family member said they felt Dahmer's fate was fitting, that he got what he deserved. Others, however, felt cheated in a sense. They wanted Dahmer to suffer every day in prison and truly face what he'd done, rather than getting an easy exit through death. One mother of a victim said that Dahmer's death didn't end her pain at all. If anything, it was just another loss of life, and it didn't bring her son back or ease her grief. In the community, Dahmer's case had already spurred a lot of introspection and changes. The Milwaukee police faced heavy criticism for the botched encounter with the 14-year-old victim and overall neglect of marginalized communities. It led to some reforms and soul-searching in law enforcement. People held candlelight vigils to honor the victims and heal the community, emphasizing that the victims should be remembered, not just the killer. The Oxford Apartments building where Dahmer had lived was eventually torn down, as no one surprisingly wanted to live in a place associated with such horror. Today, the name Jeffrey Dahmer is practically synonymous with serial murder and cannibalism. He's one of the most infamous killers in history. His story has been studied by criminologists, psychologists, and laypeople alike, all trying to understand how a mild-mannered young man turned into a predator of the worst kind. Some point to his troubled upbringing, his feelings of abandonment and loneliness, his struggles with his sexuality in an unaccepting time, or possible mental disorders. But in the end, many conclude that lots of people have difficulties in life and don't turn into monsters. There's an aspect of Dahmer's psyche that remains fundamentally perplexing and chilling. This narrative I've shared, of his background, his methods of luring and killing, his capture and his death, is a factual account, but it still leaves us with that lingering question of why. Why did he do it? Dahmer himself at times said he didn't know why he was compelled to kill, that he was sick or evil, and that if there is a God, he'd be answerable to him. It's cold comfort to the families of those 17 victims, but at least Jeffrey Dahmer can never hurt anyone ever again. His life ended as it was lived, in violence, and it serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide in the least suspected individuals. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is as tragic as it is grotesque, and even as I finish telling it, I'm struck by how real it was. These weren't characters in a horror novel. They were real people, victims whose lives were cruelly stolen by someone who, on the surface, seemed so ordinary. It's a sobering tale that will continue to haunt all who hear it, a cautionary chronicle of evil lurking behind a friendly smile.